Welcome into the newest edition of the Checkerboard Chat. We're going to have a little March Madness preview here for you today. The men's team got their bracket, and we'll figure out the Lady Vols bracket tonight, and then we'll be talking about that tomorrow, and you'll be hearing this on Tuesday. But thank you for joining us. I'm Ryan Shumpert, joined as always in this first segment by Jeffrey Russell, our UT Daily Beacon men's basketball beat writer. Jeffrey, Tennessee has a pretty solid week in Nashville. They flashed, played well in a game against Florida, and then fall to Alabama, looked great in the first half before blowing a 15-point lead and losing 73-68. Just what were your biggest takeaways from the week in Nashville?
I think you saw a team that kind of turned a corner from where it was at the end of the season. I think obviously you don't like the collapse you saw at the end of the Alabama game, but I think that's just a tough matchup, and being down the minutes that they were from John Fulkerson, I think they just kind of ran out of steam there at the end, but they fought valiantly. They were still trying to make plays to stay in the game. I think you got to like where they are at this point going into the tournament. I think, even coming out of coming out of a loss to Alabama, you going into the NCAA tournament feeling, a lot better about the team that you're seeing compared to the last few games of the regular season.
Yeah, certainly. And what they really did is they strung together some wins, and that's not something they've been able to do for a while. And obviously, they didn't win the Alabama game, but you did see a level of consistency that you hadn't really seen. They didn't look bad in that game. They played well. Now, you had the one stretch where they didn't score for 4+ minutes, and that's really they still could have won the game after that, but that's how they blew their big lead. So there were still some of the problems that they've had plaguing them, but you saw the energy. You saw them be able to make up for it with good defense and overall look crisper on the offensive end, though there were some moments of where you kind of saw the inconsistencies that we've seen all season.
Yeah, I agree. I think you were playing against, one of the best teams in the nation. I think they were the 5th overall seed in the NCAA tournament or something like that. So you obviously can't have runs like that against really good teams if you're trying to, go win an NCAA championship. But I think you definitely liked some of the things you saw with the intensity, the hustle on defense, and they were able to get out into transition. And you also saw Keon Johnson kind of make a return to form and the confidence of his play. So I think overall there are a lot of good things to take away.
Yeah, I think Keon was maybe one of my biggest takeaways of the week. He scored 20 points in that game against Alabama, 16 in the first half, had 13 in the game against Florida, but was pretty efficient, not like some of his performances where he scores double digits, where he doesn't shoot very well. And he just had that intensity to him. He was very locked in, you could tell. And that's really 4 straight games. You go back to the Auburn game, Tennessee played really bad, but he played well in that game. And in the second half, had a lot of intensity, was very locked in. I think you're kind of seeing him start to take the reins, and he's not as good of a scorer that he's going to be able to go out there and score 20 a night. Like, he just doesn't have that consistency. But I do think his ability to get to the basket, his athleticism, mixed with March being, all about guards, I think he could be a guy that really drives Tennessee this week. And the other thing that stood out to me in the Alabama game, really both games you saw it. After the Omar Payne elbow of Fulkerson, Tennessee, really got up. Pons got up in his face. The team was jawing at him, really responded, played really good physical the rest of the game. And then the Alabama game, after they were kind of a little bit of a collapse where Alabama went on a 14-0 run to make it a 1-point game, Tennessee responded well. There was 12 minutes left in the game when Alabama was back within 1. At that point, looked easily like Alabama could have coasted to a 7-8 point win where it wasn't close to the end. Obviously, the score ended up being 5, but that was 1-point game with 20 seconds left. So Tennessee really responded, and I think that's encouraging because they haven't done that at all times this year when they've had runs go against them in the second half.
Yep.
So going into the NCAA tournament, Tennessee earns a 5 seed in the Midwest region. They will get Oregon State, the 12 seed, who was not set to make the NCAA tournament before a strong run in Las Vegas at the Pac-12 championship earned an automatic bid. What were your first takeaways when you saw Tennessee's bracket and who all they could be facing here in the next week?
I think Oregon State, I think that was probably a good draw coming. Maybe that's a hot take, but I think that was a good draw coming out of the first round. I think you're playing a team that, while they are playing some of the best basketball they have all season, it's a team that still realistically wasn't, like you were saying, wasn't going to be in the tournament unless they had made a run into the Pac-12 tournament. So I think, with good defense, I think you can kind of revert them back to the mean of what they've been all season. And I think you can get out of the first round. Now, after that, a second round matchup with Cade Cunningham is probably looming. And I think that'll be a good matchup. I think your 5 stars are going to have to be just as good as he is. But you have the talent to make a Sweet 16 run. And then I think after that, probably a date with Iowa or not Iowa, Illinois. And I think after that, it's just kind of the chips fall where they may. You just got to be lucky at that point, but so does everybody.
Yeah, certainly. I thought it was a pretty fair draw. Oregon State, pretty easy first round matchup. I mean, we'll talk about it more in a second, but like we said, they weren't going to make the NCAA tournament. They're 85 in Ken Palm. To give some reference, Mississippi State was 77 and Georgia was 93. So a game on paper Tennessee should take care of. And then I think Oklahoma State's a really hard matchup. I think on Saturday, now granted they lost in the Big 12 championship game Texas on Saturday night, but on Saturday I think they were a 2 seed in Joe Lunardi's bracket. So and they're playing as good as anybody in the country right now. So that's going to be a tough draw. Certainly a game Tennessee could win. I'm not trying to say they couldn't, but it kind of balances out. And then, like you said, if they do get to the second weekend, probably Illinois waiting. Illinois kind of in the middle of the 1 seeds. Definitely rather see them than Baylor and Gonzaga. The way they've been playing, I'm not sure it would be. I think you'd probably rather see Michigan than them. But, right in there in the middle, it seemed pretty fair, easy first round, hard second round, middle, third round. So I don't think there's really anything to complain about with Tennessee's draw. But moving into that first round matchup with Oregon State, we've mentioned a little bit on them. What exactly have you been able to figure out about them, and what do you think Tennessee should be facing?
They got some good scorers in Ethan Thompson and Jared Lucas. I think those will be the guys that Tennessee will kind of have to slow down once they get into the game. Oregon State, for these past 3 games in their Pac-12 tournament, shooting, I think they haven't shot less than 40% from behind the 3-point line, and one game over 50%. So they've been hot consistently for those 3 games, but for the rest of the season, not so great. Shooting around, what does it say? Almost 35% from 3. So, they're kind of almost like Tennessee from behind the 3-point line. They're very inconsistent. Some guys can hit shots, but they're not really that great. They just seem to have caught fire at the end. One kind of matchup that I think will be good for Tennessee possibly is Oregon State does have a bigger guy, 7'1", I think, Roman Silva. I think, with Uros starting to make the run and, play that he has, that'll be a good matchup for Tennessee to get some minutes off the bench, because they'll have somebody he can match up against and not some 6'8", stretch 4 that likes to play out on the wing. So I think Tennessee does have some solid matchups with Oregon State, and I think talent will prevail whether Tennessee plays its best game or not.
Yeah, I think that's a great point talking about Euros, especially if Fulkerson can't go, which at this point seems like definitely a possibility. And we saw Saturday, Barnes is probably going to roll with Plavsic no matter what the matchup is. I mean, Alabama was not a game that he matched up well, and which is credit to him. He came in and he played pretty solid. There were times that the things that he couldn't do kind of exposed Tennessee, but overall he played well, and there's no doubt about that. So I think that's a really good point. And yeah, like you said, most seasons struggled, won 6 of their last 7 games. And I think, yeah, you said you had the stat about how well they shot from 3 in the past 4 or 5 games. Ethan Stone, our volleyball beat writer, actually tweeted out last night. He had that in there, and then the other one in there to be a little bit concerning if you're Tennessee is that they've been 32nd in offensive rebounding efficiency in their past 10 games. So another way you can attack Tennessee. Another thing that I think bodes well for them, like you said, having 2 guards, Ethan Thomas and Jared Lucas. I think you've seen a lot of times when Tennessee plays teams this year to have a little bit less talent than them and only have one go-to guard. Tennessee can really shut them down. They can rotate guys on them, good defenders, really focus their defense around them. McKinley Wright to start the year was a perfect example of that. They're not going to be able to do that as much for Oregon State, but like you said, a game that you would think that Tennessee would be able to take care of.
Yeah, I think it's a nice game to get your feet wet against a team that's probably feeling like the best it's going to feel, this season. A nice get-right game to start the NCAA tournament and gain some confidence for what's sure to be a probably pretty hard second-round matchup.
Yeah, definitely. And I will say one thing kind of closing out the Oregon State talk, but their head coach, Wayne Tinkle, Barnes was talking really complimentary of him yesterday, and, I'm just kind of assuming that was coach speak at the time. I mean, they always do, and I don't think he's ever probably coached against his teams at Oregon State or Montana. But then I looked him up, and I mean, he's been incredibly impressive what he's done at Oregon State. The 9 years before he was there, Oregon State had just one winning season. This is his
Mhm.
7th season. That'll be their 5th winning season. One of them, they went 500. And then before he'd gotten there, Oregon State hadn't made the NCAA tournament since 1990, and now they've made it. This is the second time, and obviously they weren't all that good this year, or as good as the usual NCAA tournament team is. But making the NCAA tournament is making the NCAA tournament. So I thought that was really impressive, and always, coaching is very big in March, and I'm having a good coach is a little bit of a equalizer, but again, seems like a game Tennessee should take care of. Tennessee has a good coach as well, and Rick Barnes. Moving forward, we mentioned him a second ago, John Fulkerson, still questionable, had a procedure Sunday night, and is back joining with the team, and I believe Sunday night in Nashville as they head to Indianapolis on Monday. Just how big of a deal would it be if John Fulkerson cannot go this weekend?
I think for the first game against Oregon State, I think you can get by them without him. I think you're good enough. I think you have the right pieces to get through that game without him. After that, I think if you're playing Oklahoma State, you're definitely putting yourself behind the eight ball. I think the way he started to play near the end of the season and was playing in both of those games against Florida, it seemed like he had kind of found his rhythm finally. And if you don't have that, I think it's definitely going to be tough because you're going to be putting more pressure on Yves Pons and whoever's coming off the bench to give him a spell once he needs a break. So you're definitely stretching yourself a little thin there. I think you can do it, but I definitely think it'll be tough to get past that second round game.
Yeah, I completely agree. And like you said a second ago, it doesn't kill them matchup wise not to have them against Oregon State. I think against Oklahoma State it does hurt in a couple different ways. One, Oklahoma State is not a particularly big front court. They have a lot of those 6'8" guys. They're not all necessarily great shooters, but they're really good athletes, and that could be a little bit of a matchup issue for Plosic. But the other thing I think is big is if Fulkerson can't go, Eves is probably going to have to be guarding the big guys a lot of times. And yeah, you can probably give him some runs on Cade Cunningham, some short ones when you have Plosic in the game or Olivier or any of those guys. But you're not going to be able to have him be one of the primary guys on Cade Cunningham. And if Tennessee were to play Cade Cunningham, I would think you'd be throwing Keon Johnson and Eves Pons at him, rotating them consistently. And really, for the most part, mainly just those two guys. Probably, I'm sure he'll have some other guys guard him a little bit too. But I mean, that's where it's going to start and end with Oklahoma State. So I think that would hurt them because it would just limit what they could do defensively and kind of force Pons to play strictly in the interior.
Yeah. It's strictly, yeah, I agree. It runs back to just what you can do defensively without him because defense is kind of where they're going to hang their hat. I think they can, keep up the same consistency that they had offensively. They did in the past two games. They shot around 44% and shot around 35% from three, which Tennessee can do if they play stellar defense. And, they started to break down against Alabama with the turnovers and, like you were saying, that 4 minutes of unmade baskets. But defensively, I think that's where they'll have to lock in if they don't have Fulkerson.
Yeah, I completely agree. It, yeah, that's just where it limits what you can do because of what Tennessee's depth is down low. It just makes things a little tighter. And you saw that at the end of the Alabama game because Tennessee wanted to switch those ball screens, and they either had to play Vescovi or they had to play Plosic. And now Fulkerson on Javon Quinterly wouldn't have been a great matchup either, but it's a better matchup than Plosic on him. And Tennessee was playing that balancing act of Alabama was just going to go Herb Jones at Vescovi or Quinterly at Plosic, and it certainly would have helped them a little bit to have Fulkerson. But moving on, I don't want to, give Liberty too much disrespect because I think they are a good 13 seed and they
Yeah.
beat South Carolina, beat Mississippi State this year, played a couple of other Power 5 teams close. So they're a good team. I think certainly could beat Oklahoma State, but as impressive as Oklahoma State's been, you would think that's who Tennessee would get in the second round if they made it there. What have you seen from Oklahoma State and just how challenging of a second round draw would this be?
First of all, I'd say I don't think anybody would be too upset if Liberty got the job done against Oklahoma State. I think Rick Barnes and his staff would be a-okay with that matchup happening in the second round. But I mean, I think what you were saying, it just comes down to can you keep up offensively and can you shut down Cade Cunningham defensively? Because he averages 20 points and 6 rebounds. He shoots 40% from behind the line and almost 45% from the field. They kind of go as he goes. Obviously, they have some good players, but shutting down that matchup is important. I think Avery Anderson averages 11 points, but nobody is in double digits after those two. So I think trying to shut Cade Cunningham down. He's a good player. He's going to be the number one pick in the draft. So obviously you can't shut him down completely. He's going to get his buckets, but keeping him in check and maybe shutting down Anderson is kind of the key to stopping Oklahoma State.
Yeah, I completely agree. And like we were saying a minute ago, teams that only have one really good guard, Tennessee's been able to maintain them for the most part. Now that they haven't played anybody as good as Cade Cunningham, so it'll be a whole nother challenge. What I do kind of like about it, not that those guys need any more motivation in the NCAA tournament, but Keon Johnson and Jaden Springer being guys 5-star recruits, gonna most likely be going to the NBA draft in the first round. Now talk about a matchup that they will be 1,000% fired up to play. Can probably make a good amount of money if they have good performances against Cade Cunningham. So you would have a lot of motivation in that end. And then just kind of talking about how good Oklahoma State's been playing. They've won 8 out of their last 10 games. 8 of those teams they've played, 2 of them have been the losses, have been against ranked teams. They beat Baylor just last week. They played Baylor close the week before. A couple of those wins, I believe, one over West Virginia they got without Cade Cunningham. So as good as Cade Cunningham is, as much as he is the main guy, this team's shown that they can beat good teams and be good without him. So certainly not just a one-trick pony. Finishing out here in this first segment, we did this last week with SEC tournament. We'll do it again this week. Tennessee advances to the second weekend of the NCAA tournament. They make the Sweet 16. How did they do it?
Yves Pons looks like and lives up to the moniker of SEC Defensive Player of the Year from 2 years ago or a year ago. And your 5 stars play like 5 stars. Keon started to show it in the SEC tournament, and Jaden's shown it earlier in the year. I think if they can step up to the mantle and carry you past Oregon State and Oklahoma State and give Fulkerson some time to heal, I think you got to be as confident as anybody going into that Illinois game. I think, at that point, you got to beat a good team to advance. So I think Pons playing up to the potential that he's continued to play at these last few weeks, and your 5 stars stepping up is what matters.
Yeah, I'll pause a little bit because the Pons thing, we completely missed talking about. I mean, he was fantastic on defense in the SEC tournament, 9 blocks in that game against Florida, tied the SEC tournament record. And, I think we talked about it on here a couple times probably, but I think a real concern was, could he get back to 100% on the defensive end with his knee? Because, he wasn't going to have surgery on it, could just rest alone do that. And we've now seen when Tennessee's had 2 straight full weeks off going into weekend games, he's looked much more explosive. He looked like the player he was last year. And I think that has to be a really encouraging sign for Tennessee. But going into my two keys, and Pons is one of them. I think they need either Pons or Josiah James to play well on offense. I think you should have some trust in what Keon can do. Jaden, even though he hasn't been quite as good overall, feel like he's going to be a guy that gives you double digits. Can Josiah James or Yves Pons be a little bit of an X factor on offense, give you 13 to 15 points in both those games, get a little hot for a good 2-game stretch? Or, Victor Bailey's another guy that could do it. I think those two are a little bit more important just because the ways they can score, the diversity of ways that Bailey's mostly going to hit the 3-point shots. And then the other thing I'd say, Tennessee wins the rebounding battle on the week. I think that would be huge. I think, like we mentioned a second ago, it'll be difficult against Oregon State. They're a good rebounding team. Oklahoma State isn't quite as strong as a rebounding team, and I think that's a way Tennessee can have a little bit of an equalizer in that matchup with Oklahoma State. I think the Cowboys are probably a little bit better than Tennessee, but offensive rebounding, we've seen it a few times this year bite Tennessee, where it was an equalizer the other way when Tennessee had more talent. So I think that'll be big, and I think that could be a way Tennessee gets into the Sweet 16 for the second time of the Rick Barnes era. That will do it for this segment of Checkerboard Chat. We will be back in segment 2 talking to Josh Lane and talking about the Lady Vols as they'll have their draw in March Madness as they get ready to go on Sunday or Monday. All right, welcome back to segment 2. We're now going to talk a little bit of Tennessee Lady Vols basketball, and I'm joined here as always by Josh Lane, our assistant sports editor and one of our Lady Vols beat writers, as Tennessee lands as a 3 seed in the Riverwalk region. And I want to start by saying shout out to the women's bracket for not doing the regions Midwest, South, West, East, I guess is the other one, like the men's team did when they're playing everything in the same city. I was laughing at that Sunday. That didn't really make any sense.
Yeah, with my understanding, I think those are all landmarks in maybe San Antonio or Texas where the tournament is being held. So definitely creative on women's basketball part.
Yeah, I knew the top 2. Like, obviously Riverwalk, I knew it was in San Antonio, but I was glad they were not in the bottom 2 regions because I had no idea how to pronounce what those things were.
Yeah, I know.
But Tennessee comes in as a 3 seed. They will get the 14 seed Middle Tennessee State in the first game. Josh, what were your first takeaways when you saw the bracket unfold?
Yeah, I mean, looking at the Riverwalk region with Tennessee landing the number 3 seed, not a ton of surprise there, given the success Tennessee had this year. Obviously not, one of the top 10 teams in women's basketball, but they're just kind of right outside that group. So, 3 or 4 seed, that's kind of what we were expecting, and landing that makes sense. But you look further into their region, there's plenty of competition there, and I know we'll get to that later, but you got UConn, you got Baylor, you got Kentucky, you got a bunch of other pretty good teams. So Tennessee's definitely gonna have their work cut out for them. But just kind of on the general seeding, no really surprises there for the Lady Vols. I think they got that right.
You were able to talk to Kelly Harper on Monday night after the bracket came out. Whether that was something she said about the past week they've had in practice or the bracket itself, what stood out that Coach Harper had to say?
Yeah, well, I mean, kind of off the top, they were just super happy to even be at this point in the season, right? Last year canceled, a lot of uncertainty. This year they had 2 COVID pauses, and so just to get to this point, that was kind of her kind of main, the first thing she mentioned. But Tennessee is really optimistic. They've said all year that they believe they can play with anybody. They have the talent to, and they know the work's going to be cut out for them. Like I mentioned, there's a lot of good teams in this region, so they're going to have to play well, but they're definitely confident. They know their abilities. They've been working on themselves and their issues over the last 2 weeks or so since they've, since that South Carolina game in the SEC tournament. So they're gonna bring lots of confidence in themselves and in their abilities. And that's really kind of the biggest thing that Kelly Harper was preaching yesterday.
Yeah, it should certainly be interesting, and that all starts with MTSU, an in-state matchup, an interesting Tennessee tie with former Lady Vol Anastasia Hayes really being MTSU's best player. Just what are your kind of takeaways on the matchup, and do you feel like that's a little bit of an advantage? Tennessee gets a former player that I'm sure they'll have scouted better than anyone they've had scouted all year.
Yeah, there's definitely some familiarity there. When you you ask players and coaches about that, they tend to not make a big deal as the media about it as, but of a former player being there and whatnot. But there's definitely familiarity there. They know who she is, and as a team, this Middle Tennessee team, they score really well. They 74 points a game. They average, they shoot about 40%. They make a bunch of threes. So definitely going to be a challenge for Tennessee in that regard. Tennessee's been subpar, maybe average at best on defense this year. So challenging them with some high scoring is, that'll definitely be tough for Tennessee. As you mentioned, Anastasia Hayes, they're 26 points per game is what she's averaging. She transferred out under Harley Warlick, so definitely familiarity there. But her younger sister's on the team too, Aislinn Hayes, and she's their second leading scorer. So that's kind of cool siblings there. But they're leading the way, a high scoring offense. They were the CUSA champs, so definitely should be a challenge for Tennessee. But I still think that they're favored in this one.
Yeah, certainly. It's kind of an interesting matchup. You talk about the 3-point shooting. That's always, when you're going to NCAA tournament games, potentially looking at the upsets. That's the equalizer in college basketball. And obviously Ray Burrell's a really good 3-point shooter, but Tennessee itself, overall as a team, is not great 3-point shooting. But like you said, I feel like you see these upsets, for one, happen less in women's basketball, and two, you add on the size advantage Tennessee's going to have in the interior. You would think Tennessee would really be able to run up the rebounding count and really be able to run up the scoring in the paint count against MTSU, but we will see that on Sunday. Looking forward a little bit, if Tennessee gets a round one win, they will get the winner of the 6-11 game, which is Michigan and Florida Gulf Coast. How would you kind of handicap each team's chances of advancing there, and do you think Tennessee matches up better with one of those teams in particular?
Yeah, they're pretty similar on the surface level as far as what they do. I think Florida Gulf Coast, they score, they're a little more proficient in their scoring. They shoot threes better than MTSU did. I think they average 11 threes per game. So you talk about that kind of equalizer, but that could definitely be something that if they do face Florida Gulf Coast, that could be something for Tennessee to watch out for, because as you mentioned, they've not been shooting great threes all year. They haven't really played good 3-point defense all year, so that could be it. But Michigan, they're kind of the their conference play was not as good as they hoped for. They kind of struggled through that, and then they lost in the first round of the Big Ten tournament. So, Florida Gulf Coast, they swept through their tournament, the Atlantic Sun Championship, I believe. So, they're kind of the hotter team there. So I would think, if I had to pick, probably Florida Gulf Coast, but I do think that Tennessee matches up better against Michigan. Like I said, they don't score as well. They don't force as many turnovers. Their defense isn't quite as good as Florida Gulf Coast. So, I think it's still probably a toss-up, maybe them. And, at this point, I don't think Tennessee is really has a big preference about who they play. I think they'll probably make it past that round anyways. But, if, just for me to say, I think probably Tennessee plays a little better against Michigan.
Yeah, okay, two follow-ups on both those teams that I didn't have on our layout. But Michigan, the men's team, and I think almost all their teams shut down for like 3 or 4 weeks due to COVID. Was that the same with the women's team?
I don't know for sure, but I believe they did. I can check. But I'm pretty sure they did. I imagine if the men's team was shut down, yeah, there's a couple of weeks postponement here. They had a bunch. Looks like 4 or 5 in a row. So yeah, they definitely like I said, they lost a bunch of conference play. Now we've seen that they've had about 6 or 7 games postponed. They haven't played as much basketball as Gulf Coast has, so that could be something to watch there.
Yeah, certainly that should be something interesting, and I'd imagine they've been playing a lot of games the last few weeks too to try to make up the games that they missed. I know that's been the same with the men's team, so probably a little less freshness from Michigan as you might see from Florida Gulf Coast. But on Florida Gulf Coast, I made a comment a minute ago. You don't see as many upsets or mid-majors in women's college basketball be really good, but Florida Gulf Coast, they're an 11 seed. That's really impressive. What this during the regular season were they able to do to kind of build their resume and get such a high seed for a smaller school?
Yeah, well, they flat out just won games. They were 26-2 in their regular season. So they dominated every opponent. I mentioned the high scoring that they had, like 80 points per game they were averaging, which is pretty good. That's pretty high for women's basketball. They were forcing a bunch of turnovers. They had an insane turnover or point differential. I think it was about 24 points. So they're scoring high. They're limiting you from scoring. They play good defense. Right, they got a couple of really good scorers here. Kirsten Bell and Tashara Morehouse, they're leading scorers. So that duo has been pretty good for them all year. So they're just flat out outscoring their opponents and limiting, forcing a bunch of turnovers.
Yeah, obviously, we will talk a lot more about this next week on the podcast. If Tennessee is to make it past Middle Tennessee and then the winner of Michigan or Florida Gulf Coast. But the two teams with higher seeds in the Riverwalk region is UConn as the 1 seed and Baylor as the 2 seed. Just what are your kind of initial takeaways on those two teams? Obviously, Tennessee's already played UConn. How do you feel like they kind of match up?
Yeah, for my money, UConn is the best team in women's basketball this year. They've got the best player in women's basketball in Paige Beckers. I think they're probably the obvious favorites for this region. I don't know how any other team can beat them. You mentioned Tennessee played them earlier this year. They kept it pretty competitive. It was up until just the final minutes of the fourth quarter that UConn really pulled away. But basically their starting five is always some of the top players in the year. They were the Big East champs. Beckers was the Big East player of the year, the freshman of the year. They're absolutely loaded. They score at a high rate. They out rebound you by a bunch. They have good defense. They force a lot of turnovers. They'll get a bunch of assists. They're passing the ball around. I think they're the best team in women's basketball. So it's going to be a challenge for Tennessee, just to say the least. But I imagine if Tennessee makes it, they're definitely going to have to play UConn. And then Baylor, I guess they're the defending champs. They won it all in 2019. So no tournament last year. I think they're still defending champs. They're just slightly below UConn. They do it all pretty well too. Nalissa Smith's leading the way. They're super high scorer. She was Big 12 player of the year. Led Baylor to the Big 12 championship. So definitely two of the top teams in the country. Like I said, it's going to be a challenge for Tennessee, but they're up for it. Kelly Harper, Nia Davis, yesterday they mentioned they still have confidence in themselves. They think they can play with anybody.
Yeah, certainly some really big name college women's basketball brands in that Riverwalk region. Tennessee and UConn, probably the two most famous programs of all time, and Baylor's been as successful as anyone other than UConn in the past 15 years. So should be a lot of fun, but obviously a lot to get to for the Lady Vols before that, a matchup with MTSU on Sunday, and then if they win that, a Tuesday matchup with the winner of Michigan and Florida Gulf Coast. At UTDailyBeacon.com, we'll have complete coverage of that, as well as complete coverage of Tennessee's men's basketball team in Indianapolis playing on Friday and then again on Sunday if they can get past Oregon State. Thank you for joining us this edition of Checkerboard Chat. I'm Ryan Shumpert, joined by Jeffrey Russell in the first segment and Josh Lena here in a second. You guys have a great rest of your day.